Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, back to work, back to school for millions of people, those who were not able to work from home in England. Of course, large parts of the UK, like Scotland, lots of people in a virtually effective lockdown with much stricter rules. But we're told there's going to be absolute chaos, a massive effect on NHS hospitals, on teachers in schools, and indeed on public transport and many other fields, because 1 million people are currently today self-isolating because of COVID. Do you think the Prime Minister is right to say we should stick with his Plan B measures?
I certainly don't want to see any further measures for locking down the economy. I think the lesson we should have learned is that locking down the economy is a disaster in so many different ways. It's a disaster in health terms, mental health, economic terms. It's the worst possible outcome for the poorest in society. The kids have now, some estimates are over 2 years behind in education. They were already behind before. So all these things are factors of why we should not lock down further. We've never locked down the economy previously like this, and we shouldn't do it now. So holding on and not locking down is critical. I think there are issues here which we could deal with. I think one of the big problems is that we are now so obsessed with this, the idea of catching it rather than its potency. I mean, it's clearly much less potent than Delta. So people are getting much lighter variants of it, and they're not, for the most part, going into hospital. So we now need to recognize the other damage, which is this self-isolation for up to 7 days. America, I see, has gone to 5 days, and I think there is no evidence to suggest we shouldn't do 5 days, providing you've had a clear set of lateral flow tests.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense to me, and that would help the NHS certainly and help education and various other businesses.
Well, indeed. I mean, France exactly also moved to that. And I have to say, and we had Nadeem Sahawi, the Education Secretary, on yesterday. I wanted to focus on masks in classroom, which is something I'm absolutely furious about and think is deeply morally wrong, and the lack of evidence for that. And we'll come on to that. But in a way, I felt like I should have actually given the government credit. I mean, I don't agree with a number of the Plan B measures. I think the vaccine passport's a load of nonsense. I think the face mark mandate is absolutely unnecessary and unscientifically based. And if someone can show me proof where it's shown to make a difference, I'd love to see it. But there ain't any proper scientific proof that these things work. The way people, the paper masks and the cloth masks that people wear generally. But at least we in England, and the majority of people in the UK, are not living under the far more authoritarian rules of Scotland, of Wales, of Northern Ireland. Do you think we need to give credit to the Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers who finally started speaking up in Cabinet meetings? For actually finally learning to ignore a lot of the doom-mongering modelling that we've seen, bearing in mind that back in December, Imperial College, yes, Professor Neil Ferguson, remember him, were predicting a best case scenario, not a worst case, a best case scenario for the peak in January of 3,000 Omicron deaths a day. Currently, we're at 100.
Yes, I do absolutely give credit to the Prime Minister for taking this decision. I was just quite interested too. We hear a lot from the Labour Party: follow the science, follow the science. We would follow what the scientists said. Actually, before Christmas, I was on a radio show with the Shadow Health Secretary, and what was quite interesting, I put to them the point that actually, hang on, the scientists are now asking for a circuit breaker. Would you go for the circuit breaker because that's what they're telling you to do? And they went all over the place and said, well, of course we'd follow them, and if that's what they. And my point is that we didn't, and we didn't need to. And this is very important now. The idea that all these measures do anything to stop the transmission is, I think, almost laughable. The number one thing that we should bank is that the vaccinations are critical. And, we are rolling out these third vaccines at a huge rate of knots. Quite well. Well done to the government for doing that. It is the vaccinations, antibodies and T cells, that will stop us being
Yeah.
very ill. And that's where we should focus. All the rest of this stuff, at best, maybe delays just a bit of transmission, but at worst, does absolutely nothing to stop us
Mm.
getting this. The thing is, the protection lies in our bodies, not in the outside
Yeah.
world. And that's the
It is
critical
it
issue.
is extraordinary how many people, as you say, trust the science, don't seem to trust the vaccines, don't seem to trust the really clear evidence from the vaccines, from the boosters, the difference they do make. And it's interesting also how many of the politicians and indeed large amounts of the British media are very choosy about which statistics they're interested in, because they'll focus massively on the death statistics, on ICU, on pressure on hospitals. If those are worse, when cases are high, they go on cases that are high, but they pick and choose whichever is the worst looking set of numbers. Even though, again, we've got cases absolutely sky high, but when they go down, they don't seem to notice that. And when they do not actually translate into more people on ventilators, in ICU, needing that kind of desperate help, and people actually dying en masse, they don't seem to notice those figures.
Yeah, every forecast we've had so far, and I think I'm right on this, everyone has been wrong.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Fraser Nelson should be congratulated for his exchange, which revealed categorically.
This is what I say. Just to clarify, this is the Spectator editor, Fraser Nelson,
Yes,
and
he,
he got
he
in a
had.
Twitter. He entered a sort of a Twitter exchange with the man who's been leading the modelling.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And what was interesting about it was he put to him, why is it that you deal in the absolute worst case and we never see the range of predictions that could come from your modelling? And his answer was, well, we model for what we're asked to model. And the truth is, they're only really asked to model for what could happen in the worst circumstances. But all models, economic and everything else, have a low and an up point, and you need to look carefully at what the rationale is behind them.
Yeah.
Instead of which, they go out on the radio and they suddenly explode this. And of course, it's reported as though it's absolute fact, and it's not. And the other thing I
But
noticed.
also the ministers are asked to agree to new measures on the basis of, well, look, these are the best and the worst case scenarios, even though the worst case is actually, or even the best case scenario is nowhere near the best case scenario, because they haven't included all the scenarios where actually there isn't any action that would ever even be remotely needed.
Well, it was quite interesting because this particular forecast was produced on the basis that the potency of this Omicron virus was the same,
Yeah.
at least, as Delta. And he was asked, why do you do that? And it's because they were asked to do that. They
Yeah.
weren't asked to look at the South Africa figures anymore and look at whether or not it was less potent and the effect that would have. And when you, about a week, about 4 or 5 days later, maybe a week later, suddenly all these other groups came out and said, actually, strangely, this is much less potent. It's at least 40% less potent, rising to 70% less powerful than the Delta. That has a massive effect on hospitalization, for stay in hospital, which people don't report, and on deaths and on
Yeah.
ICUs. So all of that was exempted from the original forecast,
Yeah,
on
and
which
again, we need to
bounced
know the
into
assumptions.
lockdown.
But it was J.P. Morgan, and they're an analyst who pointed out that look, this wasn't taking into account any of the real world facts. And this is the problem with making policy and making decisions about people's lives, their freedoms, their jobs, the economy, children's education, or freedom to show our faces in public, for goodness sake. Really basic stuff being made on modelling, which has been proven again and again and again to be wildly out of kilter with reality. But when we had real world stats, which we had pretty early on in South Africa, and I spoke to Angelique Coetzee, the GP and the chair of the South African Health Association, who identified Omicron. She was the first to identify it, and they were really clear very early on, and their stats were really clear that this was a much milder variant, and yet that was pretty much completely ignored by our establishment here. Let me also ask you about the JCVI chair. But this is Professor Sir Andrew Pollard, who leads the Joint Committee on Vaccinations and Immunisations. They're the people who decide on the rollout of the jabs. He's done an interview with the Telegraph today, and he says that the decision on whether to offer a second booster, so a fourth jab, shouldn't be made until more evidence that they're actually effective. And he says we can't jab the whole planet every 6 months. That's just not sustainable. We need to target the vulnerable, not boost all over 12s. Do you think he's right?
Yeah, I think, of course, he's right. That's the key point. We've got to get this in perspective much more. What we've got at the moment is there's been created a complete sense of panic about everything. So on the one hand, you've got scientists and others saying that this is terrible, it's going to destroy us all, and we've really got to lock down everything and shut down what we're doing, which didn't by any means work at all. And all the warnings about opening up schools would be a disaster last year turned out to be wrong. The key thing is we have vaccinations. We were told the two would work. They do work, by the way, against illness. They may not be as effective against transmission, but it is illness that really is the key for the vaccinations. And on 3, you are about 75% protected against
Yeah.
transmission. So the key thing here is they work. So the only thing that we have to try and concern ourselves about is if we're going to do the third jab, which we've done, and I think it was the right decision because they discovered it does tend to wane on particularly on transmission. The truth is, having done it, we need to have some faith in that third
Yeah.
jab and not rush any decisions. Israel was in a different position. They had third jabbed some time ago, many months ago, and they're concerned about the waning bit as they're in winter, but we're not in that situation. So he's right. We need always to look very carefully at what the real world evidence is, not forecasts, before we move on these things. But the government should be congratulated, the Prime Minister, for saying to the scientists that came into his room, no, I don't think we have the data that follows that you should then lock down the economy, as you are saying, and end schools. So no, and he was
But we,
right to
but
say
we, but we
that.
are, but we are still seeing a lot of that pressure, and there's no doubt at all the decision to bring face masks into classrooms will come to that pressure. I'm sorry, I'm not hearing any of that pressure from parents, and the fact that more than 50% of 12 to 15-year-olds at secondary school have not been given the jab tells you that parents are not concerned about what's happening in schools. They just want their kids to go back to school. And there are some really clear indications in terms of what people might tell pollsters and what people actually do when it comes to their families, perhaps are showing different things. But the decision to make children wear face masks all day, 5 days a week in school, including in the classroom. Nadeem Zahawi, the Education Secretary, said yesterday that the government would publish the evidence within 48 hours. So hopefully tomorrow we'll see the evidence that they have. But from as I can gather, it was an observational study, he said. They had from 123 schools, but not, I don't think, comparing schools with face masks or without face masks. Do you think there's any evidence whatsoever that our children should be forced to cover their faces all day?
I think it's very tangential whether or not just any old face mask protects you. Uh, if you really are going to go on face masks, then they very strong, powerful, big face masks that are used in full medical conditions is about the only face masks that really might genuinely protect you against the aerosol part of the virus. The other kind of face masks we wear are mostly to give others confidence because they don't massively protect against transmission because they just don't fit around your faces like the full medical ones that are shaped around your nose and everything else and are very thick with special vents on them. So, in truth, in schools, my worry would be in schools, and it has been for some time, that in schools they get in the way of proper education. The truth
Yeah.
is, ventilation, if they're really concerned about that, it's ventilation that really matters in a classroom. Opening up the higher windows and having through air going through does a huge amount to dissipate any aerosol element, far
Yeah.
more than wearing a face mask. And that's the critical bit. So if they're really concerned about that, that is the way to go. But honestly, children may transmit it to a degree, but the reality is parents are hugely still going out to work. They go
Yeah.
out to meet each other. They're doing stuff. They're almost certainly likely, if they are going to catch it at all, to catch it doing normal life. We can't shut down normal life. So my
Yeah.
concern is really that we should be very careful not to take decisions that we are absolutely not certain has been backed by real life evidence that they work. And I just don't think these casual face masks all work. They give us confidence. I don't have any
Well,
problem with
I would say quite the opposite. The confidence. I think they just promote more fear, and we know they don't work. There's simply no evidence. I mean, the idea, the virus is 500 times smaller than the holes in most face masks. It's not complicated to work out. It could go in or out. But there we are. So, Iain Duncan Smith, always so good to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.